Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. This week, another deadly one for coronavirus, with more than 47,000 Americans now dead in this pandemic, and another 4 million filed for unemployment, bringing the number to 22 million over the past several weeks, a 20% unemployment rate that the nation has not seen since the Great Depression. Joining us now is our Washington Roundtable, Ilan Berman of the American Foreign Policy Council, Byron Callan of the independent Washington research firm Capital Alpha Partners, Michael Herson of American Defense International, one of Washington's top defense lobbying firms, and later in the program we'll be joined by Terry Schultz, Brussels-based freelance journalist who reports for both Deutsche Welle and National Public Radio. Everybody, thanks very much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Great to be back.
Thank you for having me again.
And before we get started, a shout out to all of our sponsors. Our global coverage is sponsored by Leonardo DRS. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and our broader cyber coverage. Fincantieri Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. Elbit Systems of America sponsors our virtual coverage of the Quad A trade show, as well as the SOFIC trade show, and Bell, of course, sponsors this podcast. Michael, I want to start with you. You've been leading us off for the past couple of weeks, given how much action or inaction, depending on how you look at it, has been happening on Capitol Hill. We've thought that we would be on the verge of 3.5, package number 3.5, especially after the Paycheck Protection Program expired last week. Talk to us about where we stand right now, because a top-up measure has made it through the Senate but is stalled in the House. And now we've got Mitch McConnell basically urging states to file for bankruptcy, and that somehow the federal treasury shouldn't be in the business of supporting blue states, that somehow red states are the ones who deserve help. I will add that statistically, some of the blue states he's talking about take less federal tax dollars than some red states like South Carolina, for example, that only puts $1 into the Treasury and pulls out $7. So talk to us a little bit about what the political dynamic is up on the Hill.
Okay, well, it's funny. Here's the third podcast that we've been talking about the CARES 3.5 package. So I guess third time's a charm, because it did pass the Senate on Tuesday, and it will pass the House later today. What the Republicans wanted to do was just pass an extension of the Paycheck Protection Program at $250 billion. Democrats wanted a lot more in there. Republicans in the Senate refused to budge, and we wasted 2 weeks because the administration stepped in and negotiated a compromise. So the package that's passing today, which passed the Senate on Tuesday, is $484 billion. And it's broken down pretty much with $310 billion for small business, including the Paycheck Protection Program. $60 billion, again, just for geared towards small business, economic injury, disaster loans and grants, $75 billion for hospitals and healthcare providers, and $25 billion to expand testing. So that the House will vote on later today. Now, earlier today, the House was hoping to vote on the ability to vote by proxy, so that the House representatives could continue to function from a remote location. They had a plan that they were going to implement, and by 2 o'clock yesterday, it was pulled. And it became very, very partisan. The Republicans were very much against it. I'll give you an example. The Republican whip office sent out a notice to all their congressmen yesterday saying attached is the legislative text on a proxy voting scheme that was posted at 2 a.m. without consultations with the minority. Could not imagine a more fundamentally flawed process to go about attempting to change over 200 years of history in the House of Representatives. So the Democrats bowed to the pressure.
So bipartisanship is dying.
Oh, it is dying. And we'll talk more about that because it concerns me when we get to the subject of a fourth stimulus package, which will be needed. So instead, what the House is doing right now, as we speak, is voting on creating a select coronavirus oversight committee, which will be chaired by Congressman Jim Clyburn, who is the House Democratic whip. That is a purely partisan vote right now. The Republicans are against it. They feel that this committee is redundant and will be used as a political weapon against the president. However, since the Democrats control the House, this will pass and that committee will be established. they have agreed to form what they're calling an ad hoc committee on how to reopen Congress. That will be the members of that committee will be Steny Hoyer, who's the Democratic leader, McCarthy, who's the Republican leader, Congressman McGovern, who chairs the Rules Committee, Congressman Cole, who's the ranking Republican on rules, and then Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren and Congressman Rodney Davis from the House Administration Committee. So that will be their tasks. But after today, the House will go back home again, and the plan for the House and the Senate is to come back on May 4th, but it's unclear whether they really will. And attention will turn to the Phase 4 package. Now, the president has come out just the other day and said, we will begin discussions on the next legislative initiatives with fiscal relief. He made the statement right after the Senate passed their package. And the president actually mentioned funding state and local governments for lost revenue. And he continues to talk about infrastructure for bridges, tunnels, broadband, tax incentives for restaurants, entertainment, sports, and payroll tax cuts, things that will increase economic growth. So he's starting to put a little bit of meat on there. We know the House Democrats have been very forward-leaning on Phase 4, talking about, again, more aid to state and local governments. They want to talk about mail-in voting, hazard pay for healthcare workers, which will be a tough one. Again, money for the Postal Service, more direct payments to individuals, more money for food stamps. Now, part of the problem here is what you alluded to earlier, the breakdown in bipartisanship. There's a tremendous amount of distrust growing between the parties. I spoke to a member of the Republican leadership earlier this week who really surprised me. He said that they do not believe that Pelosi and Schumer are treating this as a serious crisis, that they are using these legislative vehicles to do the things that they've always wanted to do, and that we need to worry about each of these additional packages and the limits that they will put in them. And the same person told me that they feel the Democrats are trying to limit the economic recovery so it doesn't benefit the president in the fall. So this is the mentality going into the discussions on Phase 4. Now, we've talked in the past, too, about what the implications are for defense in Phase 4. And Senator Tom Cotton released his own plan last night that talks about $43 billion a surge in emergency funding, which he says to thwart the Communist Party of China's military aspirations and protect the U.S. defense industrial base. So he considers this a comprehensive package which will bring to bear the full resources of the federal government to ensure that the Communist Party of China pays a steep price for its criminal cover-up of COVID-19. And he wants to thwart the Chinese military aspirations to dominate the Indo-Pacific region and to intimidate its neighbors. He feels the United States needs to dramatically step up its investments in military infrastructure, weapons, and other assets in the Indo-Pacific region to further compete effectively with China. So
that's a great sentiment. Does this stand any chance in this fiscal climate of getting a $43 billion plus up for the Pentagon?
I do not believe that it does, but I think that it does put defense spending on the table in the next stimulus package, which he's the first person to do that. And this is going to be a lot of give and take, and the Senate really hasn't said a lot about what they see in this package. The House Democrats are, the president is. So this is the first time the Senate is really kind of forward-leaning, and this is their first shot out of the gate.
Byron, let me get your sense on how all of this is being received by markets. We've got a couple of companies that have reported at this point. Lockheed, tremendous earnings, frankly, at the end of the day. But talk to us about how you're viewing this dynamic and what you think it all means.
Well, I think a couple of thoughts. Look, the market, I think, so far has viewed this fairly benignly. I'm curious, though, as this wears on and maybe as some of the more partisan fighting, really continues to push the fourth package to the right. I just wonder when the markets start throwing another temper tantrum. I mean, it's not been a great week so far this week. You never know what's going to happen on Friday, but kind of the enthusiasm that, hey, this is going to be fairly quick and, we're all going to get back to work this summer. I think that's obviously getting pushed to the right. It is interesting to see the attitudes towards China change. I think there was a poll that came out this week. I don't know if it's Gallup or Pew that showed, really a steady increase in the number of Americans who dislike or don't trust China in this. And I think it's a fair notion to state that China is going to be a punching bag in the next couple of weeks and months as we move through the presidential campaign. I think Biden has also kind of come out critical on China and how they behave during this. So I kind of agree. I think maybe there is a little bit more for defense on the table. We talked about it earlier in the week, Vago, but Ellen Lord at the Department of Defense had talked about the need for billions and billions of dollars to cover some of the impacts of COVID-19 on the defense industrial base. I personally think, the Tom Cotton notion is a pipe dream, but I think there'll be a bit more for defense in the Phase 4 package. But then, of course, the way you open this up, kind of this red state, blue state dynamic, it's not new. It came out during Sandy. There had been criticism from some of the southern states about the amount of aid that was going to the New York metropolitan area after Sandy.
Well, Tom Cotton, I believe, was one of the people who held up aid for months and months and months for people in New York and New Jersey.
Tom Cruise is another one in
Ted Cruz, excuse me. Ted Cruz.
Yeah.
Was it Cotton? No, it was Cotton and Cruz, or was it
Cruz?
Well,
Cruz was one of them, Texas. And you see this pop up from time to time, and I find it ironic that it doesn't really seem to happen when Houston or North Carolina or South Carolina or Florida have major damage from hurricanes, other natural disasters. So I get it. It's a rhetorical tool. It's unfortunate to me because we do live in the United States of America, and it's just unfortunate to me to see those kind of cards played, particularly in this environment.
Well, Florida is number 3 on the Atlantic's taker list. For each dollar into the federal treasury, $4.50 goes from the treasury to the state of Florida.
You don't want to run this as everybody gets out exactly what they put in. I mean, I think that really would have some nasty ramifications for the entire country.
Well, I mean, and certainly New York and California would do remarkably well on both of those. Let's go to Mitch McConnell's statement, though, about default, Byron. And why don't you start us there? Because that has been a horror among smart investors, some of whom we know. We're on a sort of a transatlantic chat group with some very, very thoughtful investors in Europe. And that's a nightmare scenario.
It's the old saying, that's a very bad leak on your side of the boat. I mean, the idea that you're going to allow Illinois or New York or some of the other states that Connecticut that don't have a great fiscal posture, you're going to allow them to default. I mean, that will ripple through the economy in ways that it's going to impact these red states too. So this whole idea that we'll just let these things go and the cards will fall where they are and the markets will dictate all this. And if it's fine if New York defaults, that's not going to have any impact on Kentucky or South Dakota or Kansas. I mean, it's just silly. It's just silly.
Michael?
Well, I actually raised this issue with a Republican senator today and a Republican congressman today. And they both did not agree with McConnell's position. And they both felt that, again, this was more posturing than anything else. But, I made sure that during our discussion that I made sure they understood that, let's say, I got to think about people who are retired right now, who are relying on interest income. Many of these people buy tax-free municipal bonds that are backed by states and local governments. And by not supporting state and local governments, they could create a whole different crisis among retirees that are relying on income. And the same with the Democrats, who are looking to restrict dividend payments in the next stimulus package. A lot of people who are retired rely on dividend payments from their stocks. So I don't believe that at the end of the day, McConnell's going to have his way. And also, I got to think, Byron's more the expert on this than I am, but, the blue states, seem to have a higher tax base and provide a lot more services. So they've got room to cut. A lot of these red states who have lower taxes, don't provide as many services, they don't have a lot of room to cut. And I would think that there will be a lot of red states that will be in danger of bankruptcy, and that would change the dynamic.
Well, yeah, and to Michael's point, I think it's interesting that some of these states like Florida and Texas are really going to get walloped here by, Florida relies a lot on real estate taxes, and Texas and Florida both are going to get heavily hit by the change in travel, and particularly Texas, the fall off in energy demand. So I think, you kind of need to, I agree absolutely with what Michael said. I think this is more a rhetorical tool and something that we should actually be worrying about and making portfolio adjustments or thinking about where we're going to live in the United States. But it's just unfortunate to see it raised as even a rhetorical tool in this environment.
I want to go to the international picture in just a moment. Ilan, thanks very much. And Terry, thanks very much for both of you being patient with me. But let's just discuss attitudes toward government. The Economist thoughtfully, since the very beginning of this crisis, has been reporting about how states throughout history have ended up taking much more power during crises than they ever managed to relinquish over time. How, and that dynamic seems to be playing out behind the scenes in terms of the distrust of people in Washington. We're going to just open up our economies. You have these movements that the president has since the very beginning been spurring and encouraging. We talked about that over the past couple of weeks as well. How does that dynamic play into this, Michael? Because it seems like, and Byron, want to get your take on this as well, it seems as though that is one of the sources of agita here, where depending on where you fall on the political divide, affects where you stand on the issue.
Well, it does and it doesn't. I mean, the Republicans have historically supported the concept of federalism, where a lot of power is reserved to the states. But yet the president kept saying that he had the sole authority, to open up the government again. So, it was, I think it's the fact that the states are taking so much authority and power is really more because of the lack of guidance and assistance that they're getting from the federal government, and the inconsistency. I mean, look, the president tweets out, states must step up their testing, right? Which is his way of passing the buck because he knows they're failing on testing. Then the governor of Maryland goes and buys 500,000 testing kits from South Korea, and the president criticizes him for it. So it's completely, and it's a Republican governor in Maryland. So it's completely inconsistent. And, talk of things like what you mentioned earlier, even with McConnell's talk about states going bankrupt, and the comments of Jared Kushner talking about these ventilators, being our ventilators. What are we all paying taxes for? Our federal income taxes are much higher than our state taxes. And I think that the folks right now really have a distorted sense of what the federal government's roles and responsibilities are.
Byron?
Yeah, I think it's going to really kick off a fascinating debate. You can go back. Where do I want to begin with this? I've written about this. I mean, I think 9/11, really gave birth to the Department of Homeland Security. That whenever this pandemic is over, there's going to be a COVID-19 commission. Hopefully, it's going to be a bipartisan commission. It's not going to be a gotcha thing, but it's like there's going to be a federal response because this is something that's really going to be seared on everybody's brains, not just Americans, but it's a global issue. And I think people they're going to look for lessons learned from this. How can we do this better in the future? I think the interesting question, right? How can we respond to it better in the future? I think the interesting question is whether you could do that with existing federal structure and frankly, congressional committees, or are you going to see this proliferation of new entities to better coordinate federal responses to future pandemics? And then within Congress, maybe Michael's got some views on that. Are you going to see new committees emerge, not just kind of the temporary select committees, but a whole new structure to kind of, okay, how are you going to bring federal government to bear on this? And I also think the other part that's going to be critical to watch, because it has started to pop up with some of the stories out on who got loans under CARES Act, that it really hasn't gone necessarily to some of the people who were perceived to be most deserving of this. Instead, it's gone to larger corporations, larger businesses. And so you could see that kind of backlash again. Although I don't think that's necessarily going to be a big government, small government issue. It's I think what people are really going to want out of this is they just want competent government.
By the way, I would point that the Treasury is already asking publicly traded companies. The Wall Street Journal is reporting this as we speak. The Treasury has asked publicly traded companies, such as the owner of Ruth's Chris, to repay loans for a program meant to aid small businesses hurt by the pandemic. And there's this number of 2 million businesses that were helped by the last financial package, although there are many people who question that number, in part because of the staggering number of small businesses that actually haven't been able to get anything out of it. I think all of us know a lot of small businesses that have actually not been able to access anything. So that number is a little bit in question in the minds of some. And why wouldn't you want oversight over trillions and trillions of dollars of federal monies and where they're going? I mean, on the one hand, this is a great way to help people. On the other hand, there's all sorts of mischief that can happen at the end of something like this, including, frankly, I think, Michael, you brought this up, the largest piece of that package, it was the Paycheck Protection Program, but the second biggest piece of it was to help real estate developers at the end of the day, more so than state and local governments or even hospitals. Do you think that there's going to be some form of lasting structure here?
Yeah, I really think Byron's point is really perceptive. I think it is an analogy to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security plays well here, because I think that this select coronavirus oversight committee that they're creating will probably be, in some sense, permanent. And once we get past this, I could see it being in place to look at future pandemics to make sure that we are able to respond and learn the lessons from this past one. I mean, it's not only on the payments going out, but I see already complaints from the Department of Defense that they have not been utilized effectively. There's been a lot of struggle understanding the Defense Production Act. They built this massive facility in Seattle that never saw a patient. So I think they're going to look at a lot of the models that went into this, as well as how they did and didn't spend money, and the policies that went into effect to be able to assist the defense contractors with liquidity and cash flow, and supporting their supplier base. So I think for sure this is going to have lasting impact on the structure of government and Congress.
And now a word from our sponsor. The Defense and Aerospace Report is brought to you by the Bell V-280 Valor, bringing the mission technology of the future to the battlefield of today. Visit bellflight.com for more. Ilan, let me bring you into the conversation. You've been, we're very sorry you weren't able to join us. It's been a while since you've been able to join us, but I know that you have been following up very, very closely about what's going on in Africa and elsewhere in the world. We in Washington have a tendency of seeing what's happening in the United States, and we're focused on China. And certainly we've got all the news flow on Europe, which Terry will bring us up to speed on in a moment. But talk to us about the potential implications here in India, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, where the impacts from this disease could actually be even more dramatic. I mean, if you look at curves, for example, in some places in Africa, as well as in some places, and in India, for example, it's like a vertical face in places that actually do not have the kind of medical infrastructure that we're dealing with in Europe, the United States, or in China, where casualty rates have already been high.
No, I think that's right. And it's interesting. I mean, if you look at sort of the modeling that's been done on India, for example, or on Africa, the curves are really, really alarming. But, a little bit of humility here is necessary, I think, because we don't have all the facts and we don't know exactly how much mitigation is going to affect these curves. But we have an idea about what it might look like if they don't. There's a great report that was put out last week by the UN Economic Commission on Africa, and the modeling that they've done, if it's even remotely close to being accurate, I think is quite hair-raising. They talk about the fact that when under the best case scenario, they're looking at something like 300,000 deaths in Africa this year alone. And if there's not mitigation, if there's really no regional collaboration of any meaningful sort. What you're looking at is deaths on the order of 3.5 million, and infection of virtually every single citizen of Africa, in terms of they're modeling above 1 billion African citizens, right? So this is obviously a very dramatic scenario. It's almost guaranteed that it's not going to come to pass, but it does give you a sense of the fact that while we are in the thick of it here in the United States, and in certain places like in Europe, we're beginning to see a downward decline on infections and on the sort of the mitigation curve. In other places in the world, like in Africa, they're still on the upswing, and it could be very dramatic.
And you have to consider that in the event that we're looking at casualty rates like that, everybody is going to turn and look at the United States and other Western powers, and including China, to try to help somehow. And it doesn't particularly seem as though we're terribly interested in helping, although we did send, I think, 18 tons of masks and medical supplies to the Chinese. Terry, let me bring you into the conversation. It's been a while since you've been able to join us, so thank you so much for being here. We know how incredibly busy you are and how late the hour is over there in sunny Belgium and sunny Brussels. Talk to us a little bit about where Europe is now. Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, directed a very heartfelt apology to Italy that the European Union didn't do as much as it should have done, and looking to redress that. Italians feel a little bit bitter that their European friends did not come with greater alacrity to their help. Talk to us a little bit about what the dynamic here is as nations work to, in a measured fashion, try to reopen and try to get to some sense of normalcy.
Well, there's just been a European Council wrapped up, a video summit, what we would have called a summit before, just tonight, where all 27 gathered to discuss recovery funds and how they were going to figure out a way to basically help the southern states and even France, to some extent, the countries hardest hit by the pandemic. And they seem to be getting along better than they have in weeks past, but there's still a huge, huge question mark over how they will subsidize basically the recoveries of primarily Italy, Spain. I guess Greece to some extent always needs help, and the question is whether they will loan those countries money or whether they will give them money. And Italy came out of tonight's meeting happier than they have been in the past, seeming to believe that they're going to get grants. The Dutch, the Danes, the Germans, to some extent, the Finns have not been on board with that. But maybe there's been some progress, because I mean it is inescapable that if some countries in the Eurozone sink, others are dragged down with them. So they will have to figure this out. But that's where the EU is at the moment. And I don't think they're anywhere close to agreement on this, what they call the recovery fund. But at least they're on speaking terms. And that can't always be said. It wasn't true a couple weeks ago when they had one of these video meetings. Italy refused to sign the final document, and well, on and on and on. But anyway, things are moving along. And thankfully, the death tolls are coming under control in these countries as well, including the one I live in, Belgium, which has, due to its method of counting per capita, the highest death toll, because they include suspected deaths and not just confirmed COVID patients.
Well, and I should tell our audience that you and your young son were also suffered through fever, dry cough, and something that looked an awful lot like COVID. You're one of the toughest people I know, and for a cold to hit you like that was something pretty extraordinary.
I remember I couldn't even talk to you on the phone. I kept trying. Like it was, I think, 2 Thursdays in a row. I just told you I just can't make it. Like I could not have a phone conversation. It was really, really bad for a couple of weeks. But we're fine now, thankfully. So many people aren't. So we're happy about that.
Let me ask about perceptions about China, right? I mean, we have talked on this program on this podcast for months now about a lack of American leadership at the end of the day, and how that's going to affect the competition between the United States and China, and in Europe in particular. And there was this sense that the Chinese were making enormous inroads. But recently, there's also been quite a lot of frustration that's been directed at China, in part because almost every European nation donated equipment to China, and yet the equipment and what China has made available to European countries in return have been sold. And then actually a lot of the tests have been defective, a lot of the ventilators have been defective, a lot of the equipment's been defective. Although there is still an enormous thankfulness for the amount of Chinese doctors, for example, that came, whether in Italy or in Spain, to help the local medical staff. Talk to us a little bit about how that dynamic and how China is seen is changing, because Emmanuel Macron has become quite a stern and tough voice on Europe's behalf toward China.
Yeah, I think there has been a shift, and I'll get to another point that I wrote a piece about. I should advertise my work. And on Deutsche Welle, I wrote a piece last week about concerns.
You should. It's damn good work.
Thank you. And I also wrote a piece on the Belgian death count on NPR yesterday. So I would love it if people would go there and read my work. But yeah, on China, there was some gratitude at first, but so much of this equipment, I mean, we're not talking about small numbers, has been defective. I mean, hundreds of thousands of masks, for example, here in Belgium, hundreds of thousands have been defective. There was just another shipment that came in, I think yesterday, that was found to be defective. And in so many countries, they have not been able to use a lot of this stuff that was dropped off. And I think, this was also true of Russia. They sent in doctors, but, not quite the help countries needed. And then they started to say, hey, now we've got all these people here and maybe we don't really want them and we don't really need them. So I think that once the European countries started to step up very belatedly and help each other, people were ready for the Chinese to go back home and maybe Skype call about what they knew about the disease. It was sort of a short-lived welcome. And the concern that I wrote about was related to China, but in a different way. And that is that given the fact that so many countries are going to be in such bad economic condition, both the EU and especially NATO are now warning governments not to sell off strategic assets when they're faced with huge debts. Because as we know, after the 2008 financial crisis, years later, as Greece was having to kind of match funds in the austerity program, it sold basically the entire port of Piraeus, which would be a pretty important NATO port if there were a security crisis. And now China owns all of it. It controls 2 terminals 100%, and the third one, I believe, is virtually all Chinese. And there's a lot of concern that there's one of Belgium's port is owned 90% by the Chinese company Costco. Also 2 other Spanish harbors, and so there's a lot of concern that when countries need to earn money, that they may sell some of their most valuable, property, and NATO has specifically warned against it just last week when defense ministers met, and the European Union has sped up some legislation requiring governments to notify neighbors and the Commission if there were a questionable non-EU buyer or attempted buyer for some of its infrastructure.
Right.
So the concern about China has moved on from just defective masks to worry that they're going to come in and try to buy up some strategic assets.
And that certainly has been a concern on the senior European level for the last couple of years, where there's been much, much greater focus. And I remember last year, you and I were at an EU event here in Washington, and Jorge Domecq was speaking, the head of the European Defense Agency was speaking very articulately about that challenge in terms of the aggregate amount of European businesses that were being bought up, some of whom that were in a very of a strategic nature by China. Ilan, let me go to you before I go back to and bring Michael and Byron back in the conversation. How is this dynamic and the perception of China changing at a time when the rhetoric is getting very, very toxic. The Chinese are regularly now, as a means of state propaganda, trying to suggest that Fort Detrick and the United States military was somehow responsible for COVID as a military virus. At the same time, when there are Americans and certainly some of the president's supporters making the case that this was an engineered Chinese virus that escaped from a government lab in Wuhan, that's accentuated by the fact that the Chinese have destroyed or claim to have destroyed all of the original samples of anybody who caught the virus. How is this dynamic playing out, and what are the implications regionally? Because there was this sense that the Chinese were going to capitalize rather greatly on this and the absence of the United States. Once again, it seems like it's more Chinese incompetence that has saved Washington as opposed to any sort of strategic acumen.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily incompetence, but it's certainly overreach. I think the type of tactical shifts that Terry talked about are actually being mirrored on the strategic level. There is, the Trump administration baked into almost every formative strategic document that the administration has put out in the last 3 years is this idea of strategic cooperation, strategic competition with both Russia and China. And that has been charitably a fairly hard sell, at least in certain quarters internationally, where there was, before the coronavirus, there was a sense that, we want to continue business as usual with the Chinese, we can sort of bring the Chinese along. And I think you're beginning to see a sea change in the way international publics and international governments are beginning to perceive China. You have all these tactical data points that suggest that there's something big happening. The Japanese have set up a multi-billion-dollar fund to encourage Japanese manufacturing out of mainland China. Germany just sent a bill of particulars valued at something like $250 billion, demanding that sum in coronavirus-related damages from the Chinese government. You have the British government that is sort of on again, off again with its 5G build-out with Huawei. The foreign ministry, just in the last 24 hours, has sort of said everything is status quo, but the rumblings out of number 10 Downing Street suggest that Boris Johnson's under a lot of pressure to reconsider and to rethink that partnership. So something big is happening. And if it plays out the way it's currently playing out, what the Trump administration could find is that it actually has many more allies than it did before that think about China the same way that it does. But the devil's always in the details. So the question of what the administration does, how it harnesses that shift in opinion constructively, I think that remains to be seen.
The question is not that the administration properly identified that there is a great power competition and create strategies that are actually pretty good, whether on the national security strategy side of things or the national defense strategy, which was an inspired document. Both the NSS and the NDS, I think, deserve credit for being very good documents. The question is whether or not the United States is exhibiting the kind of leadership it has to exhibit at a time, during this great power competition. At the end of the day, you want everybody to be on your side, not sort of stand somewhere behind you with their nose pinched, in part because of your own rhetoric and action, right? I mean, I think very much the attitude of some in the White House has been, where the hell else are they going to go? They should shut up, cough up, give us money, and then get security in return, which I think has rubbed our allies a little bit raw. Let me bring Michael and Byron back into the conversation. Michael, how is the China debate evolving and developing on the Hill, where there's also been some rather extraordinary rhetoric coming out of members about reparations, about what should happen to China? I mean, how is this playing out? Because at the end of the day, I hate to be sort of the historical party pooper here, even though I am a 25-year tough on China guy. Like, the more you treat somebody as an enemy, the more historically you end up fighting them somehow, which is, I think, what we ultimately want to avoid at the end of the day, right? How do we manage to do this in sort of a reasonable fashion? Because this could have been an engineered Chinese virus, but there's no evidence to suggest the Chinese deliberately released this into their own population, killing tens and tens of thousands of people infecting every province, as we heard from the Secretary of State, right? We knew the problem was a lot worse than they claimed. We sort of don't know what's the rhetoric, what's the tone, what's the temperature, and what should we expect from lawmakers. And Byron, want to get your sort of geo-strategic take on that before we go and talk about Biden's defense ideas.
Well, I think you're correct. I mean, there is a lot of rhetoric, and I think we're going to see a lot of rhetoric. And as far as action, I think we're going to see a lot of legislative proposals. But the question is, what really ends up being decisive action at the end of the day, being signed into law, or changes in policy. But I think this is going to be with us for a long time to come. And I think a lot of this also depends on the Chinese and how they handle it. And I think that they've been handling it very poorly. I think not only did they not give us the information we needed early, but they would not let our teams in. They would not give us samples of the virus. They have kicked out many reporters from mainstream publications out of the country, and they have forbidden their own researchers from publishing anything on the origins of the coronavirus. And that feeds into this whole, whether it's conspiracy theory or actual truth, as to what the origins were and did this come from a lab, right? Maybe it did.
Well,
but
that's what a lack of openness does, right? You're
right.
not open, and therefore everybody then can question you, and then there are inconsistencies that come out, right? I mean, so tell the truth and you don't have a problem.
Exactly. And I think that, you've got this sense of this came from China. Remember, the president used to call this the Chinese virus, right? But they not only made it worse by covering up and not being truthful, but also by using the tactics the Russians used in the last election on Twitter and on the internet and on text, creating this sense of fear. They're sending out false messages that Trump's going to shut down the country tomorrow. There's a big story in the New York Times on this earlier this week that the Chinese were trying to inject that fear into our country. So when you talk about fighting them, that makes a lot of people on the Hill will say we're fighting them already, right? But the difference is, as between the Cold War we fought for many years versus our kind of Cold War we have with China, that we're economically linked with China, which we were not with the former Soviet Union. And I think there is going to be a push to bring back a lot of production to the United States. But, when it comes to actually doing it, it's going to be a very hard thing to do because we're going to have to pay a lot more for those goods that we bring back here. And there's got to be a sense too, for example, with the pharmaceutical industry, is this something that we consider national security related, that the government is willing to provide incentives to bring back pharmaceutical production? Because we do rely on the Chinese for almost all of our antibiotics and almost all of our generic drugs. Even simple things like Clorox wipes, which are hard to come by right now. I read that there's one ingredient that comes from Wuhan, which now we're unable to get, so it makes Clorox wipes hard to get. I think that there's going to be a lot of rhetoric and talk about doing it, but I think when it comes to practicality, it's going to be a very hard thing to do.
Byron, let me bring you into the conversation. I mean, from a strategic perspective, where do you see all of this going as sort of I think one of the best students of history I know?
No, but I think the rhetoric is interesting. But look, at the end of the day, this is a global crisis. It's going to require global cooperation to solve this. This is a virus. It's going to mutate. I mean, the idea that you can somehow hermetically seal this at China's borders, it's goofy. So I think, maybe to Alon's point, we really are just starting to see the impact of this virus in other parts of the world. And I think it's really going to shake people up when they see this rip through countries that are far less equipped to deal with it. So that's one level. I think the other part of this is, look, China's largest manufacturing economy in the world. You can play with the statistics, but they're not spending 3 or 4% of their GDP on their military, at least, the way we define it. And they have capacity here. And I just wouldn't overestimate or overpush. To your point, Vago, you can overplay your hand here too. I think the Chinese have overplayed their hand. Terry mentioned some of the things going on in Europe. I think I saw something that Sweden had just moved to end all the Confucius institutes in Sweden. So it's not as if this is coming off as a one-sided victory for China, as much as there's been some of the photo ops of them delivering medical kit to Italy or Africa. And I'd say, this has been a common problem with a lot of the equipment that's been stockpiled, even our own U.S. stockpiles of metal equipment. Unless that's been, refreshed on a regular basis, something sitting around in a warehouse for a couple of years is naturally going to degrade. So it's clearly going to sharpen the tension between the U.S. and China. I think that's going to play through the election. I think it's going to be hard for Biden to, extend an olive branch in this kind of environment in a political campaign. I think both Biden and Trump are going to beat on China, and but let's see how this plays out in 2021 and beyond.
We've got to wrap this up. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Byron, you put a thoughtful note about Biden and defense out. Give us a quick summation of that. Michael, I have a very short question for you, and then something very quickly for Ilan and Terry before we part. Go ahead.
Well, look, the polls have shown Trump is losing steam in some of these battleground states. I just put a note out that said, I think it's time to really start thinking about what a Biden administration is going to mean for defense. I also think you have to think about a full Democratic control on both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue. That's the point. It's not to say that it's going to happen, but it's something that people ought to really start thinking about.
Michael, but some of these polls in some of these battleground states, you and I communicate regularly. It's a dead heat in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and elsewhere, including Florida. What does that mean?
It doesn't mean anything. Because, as I say week after week, it's a lifetime between now and November. And every time you send me a poll, I send you one back that shows Trump behind. And a lot depends on who's taking the poll and how they're asking the questions and who they're asking.
Hey, I'm just interested in the dynamic. It to me is a very, very interesting polling dynamic. And all I know, 2016 and a number of other elections have told me not to believe in any poll. The only poll that matters is the big one. So
right. No, I agree. And as you know, I ran for Congress once. I did not do any polling because all the polling does is tell you the score, and the only score that matters is the score on election day.
Exactly. And sadly, the outcome is what it was, but I still think you stand a damn good shot. Ilan, let me go to you, and then Terry, very quickly to round this out. There was an overwhelming sense that the president put a very, very tough tweet out about Iran, that it's time for ships to shoot back. There is an expectation on the part of some folks in Washington that the administration is gearing up, both as a good distraction, but pretty much to try to sock Iran in the nose somehow. What are the implications of that? And Terry, how are Europeans going to respond to this at a time when let's face it, they were abiding by a nuclear agreement. They now feel not particularly constrained by a nuclear agreement because they're not getting any of the benefits of it right at the end of the day. And the government has made a whole bunch of stupid decisions, but they also managed to launch a satellite. What does a punch in the nose look like? And what are the repercussions?
Well, let me start sort of with the Iranian calculus, and I actually think that what Iran has been doing lately in terms of provocations in the Strait of Hormuz speak a lot more to regime weakness than they do to strength from the Iranian side. Iran is having what a colleague of mine referred to as a Chernobyl level event with regard to coronavirus. Not as dire as those projections that I laid out of what might be coming for Africa, but pretty darn close. And the regime has sort of harnessed this and weaponized this in distinctly political fashion. But everything that you're seeing on the street in Iran suggests that the regime doesn't really have a firm handle on the crisis, on the health crisis, and is really struggling with it. And as we all know, when there are problems at home, you go abroad. So it's not really, I don't think it should be a surprise that the regime is maneuvering more aggressively in the region, because I think it's trying very hard to project an image of strength, even as it's struggling with this crisis at home.
And what does a punch in the nose look like? And does that set off a cascading chain of events that are potentially more problematic than anything they solve?
Well, I think it's interesting that there is this very odd confluence of interests that now exists between us and the Saudis and the Iranians, where a little bit of tension that actually drives the global price of oil upward is not necessarily a bad thing in Washington. It's not necessarily a bad thing in Tehran. It's not necessarily a bad thing in Riyadh, right? So these sort of politics make for strange bedfellows. But I think on both sides, both the US side and the Iranian side, there's a lot of concern about uncontrolled escalation. I think the Iranians are very concerned about sort of stepping over the threshold. And I think they're doing now what they were doing before the January 3rd killing of Qasem Soleimani, which is that they're probing where exactly the Trump administration's red lines are. But I think they're very concerned about potentially stepping over them.
And just to round out in about 30 seconds, from a European perspective, what are the implications should the United States decide to punch Iran in the nose at the end of the day?
I think they're waiting nervously as always. I mean, we don't talk a lot about the military option here. The Europeans will be very worried. I mean, there's zero appetite for military involvement in that part of the world here.
Guys, thanks so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it, and hope everybody stays well, and look forward to having you back on next week.
Same with you all. Stay safe.
Great, thank you.
Safe.
And thanks for joining us this week. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DefAero Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. Look for our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight. Bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.